So Andy Quon is from nuclear medicine, and he attends our tumor boards and helps us interpret octreotide scans, PET scans, but I think he's going to talk more generically about imaging.
Okay, good morning. We're going to start off with imaging this morning. And so I thought the best way to start off with imaging is just show a case. And get the mouse.
And do you want the lights down a little bit? Or
it's like you said, it's kind of early in the morning. I think I'll probably keep the lights on so I don't lose half the audience. I don't lose. I might lose. I might just doze off myself. So, patient with this is a patient case. This was presented by this author from University of Pennsylvania down here in 2009. It's an outstanding case that I just found. It's a patient with who presented with fatigue, obesity over a couple of months, high blood pressure, and a change in their facial features over several months. And most internists, when you see this kind of constellation of symptoms, you realize it's kind of a Cushingoid kind of presentation. And so the standard workup consists of multiple types of images, and I thought this was a good case to show because it shows all the different types of imaging that go into diagnosing a neuroendocrine tumor. So when somebody comes in with symptoms like this, one of the first things you think of is something in your pituitary gland that's secreting an extra hormone that's causing these features to occur. So you do an MRI to start off with, and that's what this scan looks like right here. Okay, this is an MRI. An MRI is an outstanding scan, is phenomenal resolution, and it doesn't have any radiation exposure to the patient. In standard clinical care, MRI exams are primarily based for brain imaging. They're outstanding for brain imaging, but they're also good for soft tissue as well, specifically your joints, and for orthopedic applications. In terms of tumor in the rest of your body, it's not, I wouldn't say, the primary choice of imaging, except for some very specialized cases, perhaps in your adrenal gland and in gynecologic organs, etc. But at Stanford, we tend to do a lot of MRI here. We're a major MRI center, so we do some MRI tumor imaging. But for the most part, I would say if you're going across the board in the nation, in the world, MRI is an outstanding exam primarily used for brain imaging as well as for orthopedic applications. Okay, in this patient, we start off with a workup with an MRI of the brain to look at the pituitary gland, and this pituitary gland was normal. We don't have to get into too much detail here, but the MRI that was done is normal. Now, they still have these symptoms. They did some labs. They found that the labs were not normal. The labs had a phenomenal increase in cortisol levels in the patient. So there clearly was something in this patient that was causing these symptoms. This wasn't somebody just imagining this. So they went ahead and did the next line exam, and that is to look in the rest of the body for perhaps something that's hiding in the rest of your body that's secreting this extra hormone that's causing these symptoms. And when you do a CT scan, and this is a CT scan now, it looks kind of like this slice and this slice here are from the same CT scan. These are cross-sectional images that are taking cuts right down the middle of your chest this way. Okay, like this, and then like this. So two slices, one through the chest, one through the abdomen, that shows the inside of your body. And so let me give you a little bit of the topography here. This black space are the lungs. These two little black holes, these are actually your bronchus. As they're coming down, you have your trachea, and that splits into two, and you have the bronchus. These bright structures, these are your vessels. The reason why we inject contrast into patients is that we can delineate the vasculature in your body, and that helps us as interpreters differentiate normal vasculature from abnormal tumors. In this particular patient, there's a white arrow here showing a tiny little 1 centimeter, less than a peanut size lesion here, wedged next to the bronchus and in between a vessel. And so this illustrates why we have to give patients contrast. If this contrast didn't exist in the vasculature, it would be almost impossible to see this tiny peanut-sized lymph node. So that's not normal in this patient. So, we found something already in this patient who presented these symptoms. And then, additionally, when we look down here in the abdomen, this is the liver, This is the spleen. These are more vessels. The pancreas. These are the kind of things that we're looking at as radiologists, as interpreters, when we're looking at these scans. Right down here, these are the adrenal glands. Normally, the adrenal glands in your body, they sit right on top of your kidney, and they're just wafer thin. And I mean, literally, they're shaped like wafers. They're kind of a little bit triangular shaped. They're incredibly thin, thinner than a pinky, actually about half the size of a pinky. In this particular person, the adrenal glands are also enlarged, actually about 4 times enlarged on both sides. So now we have an interesting picture. We have somebody who presented these symptoms. It looks like they're Cushingoid. They have some kind of syndrome where increased hormone production is occurring. That was confirmed by a blood test. The MRI ruled out the possibility that this hormone was coming from the pituitary gland, which would be candidate number 1 for that possibility. We now have done a whole body CT looking elsewhere for perhaps a tumor in the rest of the body that would be producing this hormone. And now we've found perhaps a lymph node, but maybe not a lymph node, maybe a tumor, a very tiny tumor, and very enlarged adrenal glands, which certainly could cause the increase in hormones and these symptoms. So now you start thinking, okay, what's the real pathology? Is this tiny little lesion really the root of all evil here? Or is it actually a primary problem with the adrenal glands that's causing the issue? So now we're going to move on to a third test, okay? Actually, you can say fourth, and a third imaging test in addition to the lab test that's already been done. And the next test here on this screen is an octreotide scan. Okay, some of you may have heard of this. This is an octreotide scan. This is a scan where we inject a radiotracer into a patient, and that radiotracer very specifically homes in on tumors that secrete extra hormone abnormally and doesn't really get taken up in any other kinds of tumors. So it's a very specific, very it's an elegant type of way of looking for this particular type of tumor. And so this this scan is a little bit harder to interpret. There's not very much anatomy to look at. So the abnormality here, of course, is this black arrow, and this is dark spot. All of this is the normal liver. This is a normal spleen, and there's a kidney in here, and a little bit of bowel. But this is the abnormality, and this focus is not normal. It's sitting in the chest. And to help us with the anatomy, by software and other methods, we put this octreotide scan on top of the CT scan and fuse them together in software to really pinpoint where this focus is located. And it turns out that focus is located exactly where this tiny little peanut-sized nodule was initially found on the CT. And so now we go, aha, now we're getting somewhere. This is not just a lymph node or something that was incidental. This lesion is picking up this radiotracer called octreotide. This radiotracer is very specific for a secreting tumor, specifically for neuroendocrine tumor. And so now we know that this is likely at least one culprit for this person's symptoms. Okay? So in fact, this person ultimately ended up having a resection of this tiny nodule because there's, on this octreotide scan, no other metastases were found, and they thought that this person would be amenable to surgery. This was taken out. 6 months later, a follow-up CT was acquired. This, of course, was removed, which was the purpose, but also the adrenal glands returned back to normal size. So in fact, this tumor was secreting a stimulatory hormone that stimulated the adrenal glands to cause all of these symptoms in the first place. Okay? So I thought this was a very nice case. Again, this is not my case. This is a case that was submitted from the University of Pennsylvania. But I thought it was an outstanding illustration of how we use imaging in all the integrated fashion and put it all together. Okay? All right, so you probably have, I know this is probably a very sophisticated audience, but I thought it would be useful to say, find out what the heck some of these scans are. So first of all, a CT scan. A CT scan, is simply it's like a standard X-ray, except for this X-ray is mounted on a machine that rotates around your body. And it takes not just one X-ray, but multiple X-rays. In fact, it takes multiple hundreds of X-rays, if not thousands, as it goes through your body and rotates around. And it's a very clever device where here's this is a schematic. Here you have the X-ray source on one side, and mounted 180 degrees away from that source is a detector. And you can imagine, if thinking back just to standard X-ray, that I think most of you understand how that works. This is shooting the beam of X-rays through the patient, and this kind of acts as like the film, this detector, and then you put one image onto this film, except that this X-ray source is rotating through the patient's body and constantly taking pictures many times a second. And in fact, you can acquire about 300, anywhere between 300 to 2,000 images as you go across your whole body in less than about 10 seconds now on a modern scanner. It's a phenomenal device. And so that's the basis of an X-ray. And again, sometimes we inject contrast, et cetera, and that highlights the vasculature. Sometimes we inject other types of materials to highlight other structures, and that helps us interpret the CT scan. But multiple images are acquired through your body, and that's how we look at the inside of a patient. Now, what if we wanted more, not more sophisticated techniques, but I should say more functional techniques? This CT scan tells us a lot about the anatomy, the specific topography or geography of a tumor and the patient's insides. Now we need to interrogate the tumor itself, and you want to look at some of the functionality of that tumor. What kind of material is it secreting? What's it taking up on its cell surface? So in neuroendocrine tumor, we actually, nuclear medicine has some very elegant tools to look at that. So let's dive into a tumor itself and dive very deeply and look just at a single cell. And I apologize if this picture is a little bit complicated, but I'll explain here. So this is just a single cell. And this is what's happening when we try to image you with more functional type of techniques. These cells are complicated. They are incredible networks, almost little tiny little cities. They have power plants, and they have areas where they bring in energy, glucose. They have receptors that modulate the tumor in the cell. So some of the techniques that we use take advantage of this. On the surface of a neuroendocrine tumor cell, there are actually somatostatin receptors. It turns out that some tumors can actually be modulated by drugs on the cell surface. They don't just grow willy-nilly. They actually have some semi-modulation, meaning that they can be controlled by external drugs or compounds. And that's mediated, at least in part, in some tumors, by a somatostatin receptor. Somatostatin normally in a normal tumor receives growth hormone and other types of compounds. We can take advantage of this fact by looking at the somatostatin receptor and making a compound to bind to it so it helps us with imaging. And I'll show you that in the following slide. Another possibility is that all tumors need glucose to grow. And they have a transporter that brings in glucose, it brings in sugar within the cell to help them grow. And again, we can take advantage of this fact to help with imaging. In fact, what we do is that with somatostatin, for example, we have made an analog to somatostatin called octreotide, or sandostatin is the trade name. Octreotide looks like somatostatin to a neuroendocrine tumor cell or any other cell. And it binds to the somatostatin receptor on the cell surface. Okay? That's fine and good, but we have to take it one more step. And we take that same octreotide molecule and we put a little bit of radio-label it with a little bit of radioactivity called indium-111. Okay? Now, once we've labeled it with indium-111, now it's emitting radioactivity. So we have this octreotide that binds to the cell surface of a neuroendocrine tumor cell, and that's bound in turn to a little bit of radioactivity, and that's emitting radioactivity, and that helps us image that tumor. We can also take it a step further by linking octreotide to not a low radiation molecule, but a high radiation molecule like lutetium-177, and that would actually cause a therapeutic effect by irradiating the tumor. Okay? So it's a really quite elegant way of getting at just tumor cells. With glucose, we have a similar fashion. We take glucose molecule. We take a glucose molecule. We bind it to a radioactive molecule called fluorine-18, and now we have a radioactive glucose molecule, and then we inject that into patients. That gets taken up into tumor cells, and we can image that as well. Okay, so that's illustrated here. The principle of all nuclear medicine scans is to inject these types of molecules into patients, let them circulate around, let them get taken up into the tumor cells, and then put patients into a scanner, which then detect the radioactivity coming from tumor sites. All right, so that's the concept behind this nuclear medicine imaging and octreotide scanning, as well as FDG PET scanning. So let's look at some more cases. I want to make the first thing I'm going to talk about is octreotide scanning, and related to octreotide scanning is what we call SPECT scanning. When somebody says we're going to do a SPECT scan, it means pretty much, at least for the people in this room, it means that you're going to get an octreotide scan. If you get a PET scan, you're going to get injected with glucose. If you get a SPECT scan, in the context of neuroendocrine tumor imaging, you're going to get an octreotide injected. Okay, so let's start off with octreotide scanning. So the standard of care, as I've shown you in the initial slide, is that you get CT, MR, and sometimes you get an ultrasound depending on where the suspected tumor is. As an adjunctive imaging exam, you get octreotide imaging. And I'm going to go into that a little further in a second. A secondary evaluation would be FDG PET, and this is for after you've been diagnosed with tumor, and in follow-up you may get an FDG PET scan. And other things that are coming online, novel techniques that we're looking at, are what we call gallium-68 somatostatin PET-CT imaging, and lutetium octreotide therapy, which I'll touch on briefly today, but I think maybe perhaps George and Pam will talk about more about that in more depth later this afternoon. Okay, so let's look at what an octreotide SPECT-CT image looks like. This is once we've injected this octreotide material, and again, octreotide binds to the somatostatin receptors on the cell surface of a neuroendocrine tumor. We can then scan the whole body of a patient, and all we see is the liver, kidneys, a little bit of spleen, and a little bit of bowel, but there's something here in the middle that's not in bowel and that's not in kidneys that's standing out. So what we do then, to delve into a little bit of more detail, this scan, it requires us to inject you on day one, inject a patient on day one, and come back on day two to get imaging. If we can't resolve little spots like this on day two, we actually go to day three and see if that spot stands out even more. In fact, in this particular case, that spot does stand out a little more. And so now we have to make some tomographic cuts through this area, what we call a SPECT scan. And now we're looking at a very detailed, thin slice cut through this plane and focus in on this tumor here. And then we do a CT to fuse those together to get a really strong idea of where this hotspot is located. And this particular person, it looks like it's located near the pancreas. It's pancreatic gastrinoma. Okay? So that's how we use this scan in multiple sequences, how we arrive at an interpretation. Here's another case. Here's the patient, here's the liver, here's the spleen, here's the kidneys. We've injected the radiotracer already, and now we see again a spot here and perhaps a spot here. We take tomographs, three-dimensional reconstructions of the image, and see, okay, well, this spot is located down here. It's over here. We need a little bit of more anatomy. Let's get a CT and fuse that together. Ah, this spot is actually located within the mesentery in the bowel, located near your vessels, near your patient's vessels. And in fact, this person has a metastatic carcinoid in the mesentery. So this is how we use this type of octreotide imaging, and we combine it with CT on a modern SPECT-CT integrated scanner to arrive at interpretations. Okay, so this is, the full name is indium-11 octreotide SPECT. It's a mouthful. Most of the time we just say, get a SPECT scan or octreotide scan. So what's the benefit of this type of scanning? Well, it's good additional information to CT or MR and ultrasound. You generally don't use octreotide as a screening tool. You wouldn't just go straight to an octreotide scan to diagnose a neuroendocrine tumor. You start off with a CT and MR. Sometimes when the CT and MR are negative, but your lab values and other things are positive and there's this discordance and it's a problem, that's the time to go to an octreotide scan. It provides functional information. This functional information is not just important for diagnosis, as in the cases I've showed you, but it also aids to find out therapeutic options as well. If your tumor is octreotide positive on imaging, it means that it must be amenable to octreotide therapy as well, right? As opposed to if the tumor is completely octreotide negative on imaging, that would suggest that the tumor is not amenable, would not respond to octreotide therapy, because this is going to inform us whether or not there's a lot of cells in that tumor mass that is taking up octreotide. And therefore, if you're going to give therapeutic octreotide, is that going to be futile or not? Right? It also tells you on the information the extent of metastatic disease. It's a relatively sensitive and specific technique, so perhaps the CT can find one or two sites, but it might not find all the sites, and therefore we can use octreotide as an adjunct to CT as an additional information. Nowadays, the new technology with this technique is to have an integrated SPECT-CT, which we have at Stanford. And that's, as I've shown you in the previous slides, it's very important to get that CT and fuse it together, really get a strong idea of where tumors are located. Not everybody has a SPECT-CT. It's a relatively new device. Some of the faults, relatively low resolution. The resolution is poor. It's hard to see a lot of detail unless you get very used to looking at these images. Helps a lot to have a SPECT-CT. And it's a lengthy exam. Realize that when you do an octreotide scan, this is a scan that's going to spread over days, coming back to nuclear medicine clinic day 1, day 2, sometimes longer, as opposed to the CT that gets done in a few minutes. Yeah.
We're just about out of time.
Okay.
So if you can give like a 3 to 5 minute wrap up.
Yeah. In fact, let me skip over to that. Sorry, I spent a lot more time than I thought on the... but I'll be around for questions, and I apologize. Let me, I know specifically Pam and George wanted me to talk about octreotide therapy, and I'll just end on this, okay? So, as opposed to just giving octreotide therapy, you can actually you can radio label octreotide with a molecule that's incredibly high dose, and that's lutetium-177. This provides a remarkably high dose in a very small, defined area. This was developed by Eric Krenning in the Netherlands, and you can look it up. This website is on your syllabus, I hope. And he's done this in several hundred patients. He's got very good results. And but the concept basically is what I've shown you in that one of the initial slides, where we're taking advantage of the fact that there are somatostatin receptors on the cell surface. We inject patients with a somatostatin analog, namely octreotide, and then that analog is also linked to a molecule that's very radioactive and damaging in a small local defined area. And you can actually achieve tumor response this way. This is a patient who received octreotide therapy, and here's the response of the multiple tumors in the liver before and after this type of therapy. Okay. And so this is not available right now at this moment in the United States. There's a group, and I'll back up, out in Houston, I believe, called Excel Diagnostics, and I have no relationship to this group, and you can again look it up on the website. They're trying to go through the FDA approval process and the validation, et cetera, of this technique and bring it to the United States. So with that, I'll summarize, and again, I apologize for going so slow, but several clinical options for evaluating neuroendocrine tumor. There's CT, there's MR. Integrated SPECT-CT with octreotide, which I went through in detail. There's FDG PET-CT, which I apologize we didn't have a whole lot of time to go through, no time in fact, and MIBG scanning as well in patients with specific pheochromocytoma and neuroblastoma. New things coming up are a PET version of octreotide imaging called gallium-68 somatostatin imaging, and F-DOPA PET that has also been in use. And like I said, there's a new therapeutic option related to octreotide imaging called lutetium-177 octreotide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Quon. So, Dr. Quon, you touched briefly on the gallium-68 PET scan. You know, I think this is something that we've all heard. These great, it's better. That's the that's the rumor mill. This is a better scan. Could you talk a little bit about what some of the advantages of the scan might be and when it can yield a different therapeutic outcome?
Yeah, I think it's actually pretty simple. The gallium-68 somatostatin imaging is the same as octreotide imaging, except that it's done on a PET scanner. Otherwise, the principle is the same. The resolution of a PET scanner is many-fold better than a SPECT scanner. It's definitely the way to go. However, it takes time for the approval process to develop this radiotracer in terms of getting it through the FDA. It's being done in Europe, in humans, in clinical use.
And for patients that are going to be going through long-term scanning, CT, MRI, Octrea scan, maybe PET scan, should they be worried about the accumulated radiation exposure?
Yeah, I knew that question was coming, so I actually had made a slide for that. Unfortunately, I didn't get to it. So briefly, and I looked all this up last night, in fact, because even I don't remember all the numbers. Okay, so to give you an idea of the numbers, CT, whole-body CT scanning, the total dose is 2,000 millirems. Okay, I know that doesn't mean anything, but it's all relative. 2,000 millirems. A PET scan is about 1,000 millirems. Okay, octreotide scanning is about 2,500 millirems. And what am I missing here? And then a single transatlantic flight over the North Pole, which is about a 10 to 15 hour flight, is about 200 millirems in that flight. Okay, so you can get an idea relative to that. In a total year, as a radiation worker, I'm allowed 5,000 millirems per year of exposure without any damage to myself. So that kind of gives you the relative.
Or if you live in Denver for a year, that's about 200 millirems.
Or Australia.
So,
yeah.
So thank you, Andy. So we will have a chance to talk a little bit more about PRRT, but lest our Dutch audience here take too much credit for Dr. Quirkenboom et al., there's also centers in Basel, Switzerland, Bad Bergen, Germany, and in Uppsala, Sweden, that are doing this similar type of therapy. Baylor is the one in Houston who's just got an FDA approval to do a phase 1 study with it to demonstrate safety. Pam and our group were working with the NCI task force in order to try to bring that therapy to the United States and do it in a manner that the FDA will be satisfied with our testing so that they can ultimately get approval. So that's the first step, is just to do phase 1 testing, and Baylor will be starting that in Houston sometime soon.